I saw my dead husband's face on my daughter-in-law's phone, and my mouth went dry like I'd swallowed dust. 3 years of mourning collapsed in one silent screen glow. My hands stayed calm, but something inside me cracked so hard I almost heard it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply understood that grief had been used to blind me. Ria's living room still smelled like lemon cleaner and baby lotion, the kind of clean that makes people think nothing evil could ever grow there. I had come unannounced because I was visiting a childhood friend nearby. The door opened quickly, almost too quickly, and Ria's smile landed on my face like practiced kindness. She hugged me, warm and familiar, and called me Mama, the way she always did, as if that word alone could prove loyalty. Ria fussed over me, took the bag from my hands, and talked fast about work and deadlines, about how she'd been meaning to call, about how she'd missed me. She offered me a drink and asked if I wanted something to eat, and I told her water was fine. She walked to the kitchen, calling over her shoulder that she'd be right back, and for a few seconds it was just me. I sat on the couch with my purse on my lap. Then her phone rang. It was on the arm of the couch, screen facing up, bright and careless. I wasn't trying to pry. My eyes just landed where the light pulled them. The lock screen photo stopped my breath. Bram. Not a picture from a funeral program, not a framed memory. A clean, recent image. His face angled toward the camera with a half smile I knew too well. Beneath it, a message preview flashed for only a second before the screen dimmed again. But it was enough to turn my bones cold. I didn't reach for the phone immediately. My first instinct was denial. Maybe an old photo saved somewhere. Maybe a mistake. Maybe my tired mind searching for ghosts where none existed. But the call notification pulsed again, lighting the room in that pale glow, and this time my hand moved before my thoughts could stop it. I lifted the phone slowly, careful not to tilt it or unlock anything by accident. The wallpaper shifted slightly as another message came through, and I saw his name. Not as a memory, not as a tribute, but as someone still speaking into her life. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought Alon might hear it. From the kitchen, Ria's voice floated toward me, soft and casual, asking if I wanted ice in the water. I swallowed and answered back just as gently, my tone steady enough to fool even myself. No ice is fine. I lowered the phone exactly where it had been, matching the angle, the position, every tiny detail, because instinct told me that whatever I had just seen was not meant for me. Ria returned moments later, handing me the glass, her eyes searching my face the way people do when they think you might be hiding something. I took a slow sip, nodded at whatever she was saying about work schedules, and listened without really hearing her words. Every movement felt heavy and slow, like I was walking underwater while the world around me stayed normal. I asked about her next trip, keeping my voice light, and she answered without hesitation. Another work assignment, another 20 days away, another reason she wouldn't be around. I nodded again. Been storing the information quietly instead of questioning it. We spoke about Alon's preschool, about groceries, about nothing important, and when I finally stood to leave, she hugged me tightly, whispering thanks for always being there for her. The words pressed against my chest like weight. I stepped outside into the afternoon sun and closed the door behind me with gentle care. My car felt smaller than usual when I slid into the driver's seat. For a long minute, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there staring at my hands, remembering a man I had buried, a daughter-in-law I had defended, and a child I had loved without conditions. Shock wanted me to go back inside and demand answers, but something deeper, something colder, told me silence would reveal more than anger ever could. I pulled my phone from my purse. He'd scrolled to a number I hadn't touched in years and held my breath before pressing call. If Bram was truly gone, then what I saw was impossible. And if it wasn't impossible, then I was done asking questions out loud. I was going to start looking for the truth myself. Elon's laughter was the only sound that ever made the house feel full again. After my son, Corin, died, silence had settled into my walls like dust. But a child doesn't let silence stay for long. Every morning began the same way. Tiny feet against the hallway floor, a sleepy voice calling my name, and my hands reaching for him before my thoughts even woke up. Raising him hadn't felt like a burden. It felt like purpose. While other grandmothers talked about occasional visits and holiday sleepovers, my days were filled with diapers, preschool songs, grocery lists, out in the quiet math of stretching money further than it should reasonably go. People often assumed I stepped in because Rhea couldn't cope, but that wasn't true. She loved Elon in her own way, and I loved her enough not to judge how grief rearranged her life. When she told me she needed space to work and rebuild, I offered my home without hesitation. Bills increased. My savings thinned. I cut small comforts out of my own routine so that Elon never felt the absence of anything important. I never kept score. That was simply what family meant to me. Rhea visited when she could, always arriving with tired eyes and careful smiles. She'd bring small gifts, toys, snacks, sometimes clothes, and thank me more than necessary. I believed her when she said her job required long travel rotations. 20 days away at a time sounded exhausting, but she explained it with enough detail that I never questioned it. I admired her resilience, honestly. Losing Corin so early in their marriage would have broken many people, yet she kept moving forward, and I wanted to be the one person who never added pressure to her shoulders. Still, routines reveal things that emotions try to hide. Over time, I began to notice patterns that didn't sit right, though I buried the thoughts before they could grow into suspicion. Her trips always started mid-month, almost to the exact day. Her calls to Elon during those trips were brief, loving but oddly timed, like she was always stepping outside or whispering from somewhere she didn't want to be overheard. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief had made me sensitive to absence. A trust is easier when you've decided someone belongs to your family. I kept calendars on the kitchen wall, old habits from years of managing a household. Appointments, grocery reminders, Elon's preschool events, even the days Rhea said she would be away. At first, the notes were just practical markers so I could tell Elon when his mother might call or visit. But after the afternoon at her house, after seeing that phone light up with a face I had buried, the calendar looked different when I returned home. Patterns that once felt harmless suddenly carried weight. I stood in front of it that evening while Elon colored quietly at the table, tracing my finger along the dates. 20 days gone, 10 days back, then gone again, every month. No variation, no holidays missed, no unexpected extensions. Just the same rhythm repeating like clockwork. I opened my drawer and pulled out the previous year's calendar, then the one before that, flipping through pages I hadn't looked at in months. The marks lined up too perfectly, as if someone had designed the pattern instead of lived it. My chest tightened, not from anger, but from the slow understanding that trust can make you ignore what logic tries to show you. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the nights Elon fell asleep on my shoulder while I whispered stories about his father, the way I defended Rhea whenever distant relatives asked too many questions. None of it felt wasted, but it felt suddenly fragile, like a story that might not be true anymore. I sat at the table, pulled a pen from behind my ear, and encircled the next date she was scheduled to leave. Then I counted backwards from it, calculating the exact number of days she had been gone every month for 3 years. The numbers matched too neatly to be coincidence. For the first time, I wasn't just remembering what I saw on her phone. I was measuring it against the life I had been living. And that was when it hit me. This wasn't a routine shaped by work. It was a schedule built with intention. I hadn't spoken to Soren in 4 years, not since the day our argument ended with a slammed door and a silence that felt permanent. Family disputes have a way of digging deeper than strangers ever could, and ours had started over property. A house Bram once insisted should stay in his name, a decision that turned into a battlefield after his supposed death. Soren believed I had trusted Bram too blindly. I believed Soren saw betrayal where none existed. Neither of us won. We simply stopped calling. The number still sat in my phone, unchanged, like a reminder of a bridge I had chosen not to cross again. My thumb hovered over it longer than I wanted to admit. Pride told me to handle everything alone. But pride had never uncovered truth. Patience and evidence did. I pressed call before I could rethink it. He answered on the third ring, his voice cautious, as if he already knew I wouldn't reach out unless something serious had cracked the surface. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Years of distance hung in that silence. Finally, I said his name. Not an apology, not an accusation, just his name, steady and clear. That was enough to shift the tone. He asked if I was all right, and then I told him I needed help. Not emotional comfort, professional help. We met the next morning at a small cafe halfway between our homes, neutral ground neither of us could claim. Soren looked older than I remembered, sharper around the eyes, like someone who had learned to read people for a living. He listened without interrupting as I explained what I saw at Ria's house, the phone lighting up, Bram's face staring back at me like a ghost that refused to stay buried. I didn't dramatize it. I simply laid out the facts. Old resentment flickered between us when I mentioned Bram. Soren's jaw tightened, and for a second I expected him to reopen arguments we had buried years ago. Instead, he exhaled slowly and nodded. "If you're right," he said, "we don't guess. How we verify?" That was the moment our roles shifted, from siblings carrying old wounds to partners chasing clarity. He explained the limits first, the way professionals do when they want to keep emotions from steering the wheel. No illegal access, no reckless confrontations, no assumptions without proof. Everything would be documented quietly. Travel records, public databases, financial traces that didn't require breaking the law. It wasn't revenge yet. It was groundwork. I handed him the dates from my calendar, Ria's monthly trips, the pattern that felt too precise to ignore. Soren scribbled notes, already thinking 3 steps ahead. He suggested starting with Bram's death records, verifying every document filed when he was declared gone. If someone had manipulated that process, there would be administrative footprints. On paper, trails rarely disappear completely. We spent hours going through possibilities, speaking in low voices that felt more like strategy than family conversation. At one point, he paused and looked at me carefully. "Are you ready for whatever we find?" he asked. The question wasn't dramatic, just honest. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I thought about Ilan sleeping peacefully in my home, about Ria hugging me like I was still her safe place, about the years I had trusted a narrative that now felt fragile. Finally, I nodded. Truth mattered more than comfort. By evening, Soren had already pulled preliminary records from public databases. We sat in his office, small, cluttered, practical. As he opened a laptop and began scanning through financial registries tied to Bram's old accounts, most of them were inactive, and exactly as they should have been. But one entry made him lean closer to the screen, his expression tightening. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned the laptop toward me slowly, letting the information settle before words did. A recent transaction, small, almost forgettable, linked to a utility account in another state. The account holder's name wasn't Bram's, but the funding source traced back to an old financial pathway that should have gone quiet the day we buried him. Soren tapped the screen once, firm but controlled. "This," he said quietly, "shouldn't exist." The address didn't look like anything important at first, just a quiet street in a town I had never heard Bram mention when he was alive. Soren printed the utility record and slid it across the desk toward me, his finger resting on the line that tied the account to a rental property. No grand estate, no hidden luxury, just a modest house paid through a chain of transactions that circled back to an account Bram once controlled. If grief had been a fog around me before, it began to thin right there in that chair. "I need to see the place," I said before I could stop myself. Soren didn't answer immediately. He studied me the way investigators do when they're deciding whether a client is ready for the next step. Finally, he nodded, but his tone stayed careful. We wouldn't confront anyone. We wouldn't make contact. We would only observe. That word, observe, felt colder than anything else he had said so far. 2 days later, we drove across state lines, silence stretching between us like unfinished conversations. The closer we got, the heavier my chest felt. I kept telling myself this could still be coincidence, an old account used by someone else, a clerical error, anything that didn't force me to rewrite the past 3 years of my life. Denial is quiet. It doesn't shout. It whispers reasons to turn back before truth becomes unavoidable. The town itself was small, the kind of place where strangers stand out without trying. Soren parked a few streets away, and we walked the rest of the distance slowly, blending into the rhythm of afternoon traffic. The house sat at the end of a narrow lane, plain, neat, curtains drawn halfway, as if someone inside preferred privacy without fully hiding. There were no signs of wealth, no hints of a man who once moved confidently through my world. Just a porch chair, a trimmed lawn, and a car parked in the driveway that looked painfully familiar. My feet slowed before I realized it. The license plate matched an old registration Bram had transferred years ago. Soren's hand brushed my arm gently, grounding me before emotion could take over. We didn't approach the house directly. Instead, we lingered near a small cafe across the street, pretending to study a menu while watching reflections in the window. That was when another layer of truth began to settle in. A woman stepped out of the house, her posture unmistakable even from a distance. Rhea. She wore dark sunglasses and moved quickly, checking her phone as if she had somewhere important to be. My stomach twisted, not from anger, but from the slow collapse of explanations I had clung to. Her monthly work trips were no longer abstract dates on a calendar, and they had a location. They had a door she walked through. Soren scribbled notes quietly, his focus steady, while I struggled to keep my breathing even. Emotional denial didn't shatter all at once. It cracked in small, painful lines. Every memory of her thanking me for raising Elon, every hug at my doorway, every promise that she was working hard to rebuild her life. They all began to feel rehearsed. We stayed long enough to document the timeline. Rhea left in a rideshare, and the house fell quiet again. Minutes passed, then the front door opened once more. A man stepped onto the porch, adjusting his jacket, his face turned slightly away from us at first. I told myself not to look too closely. That distance can distort shapes and make ghosts out of strangers. But when he turned fully toward the street, the air left my lungs in one silent rush. Bram. Not a memory, not a resemblance. Him. Alive. Breathing. Moving, as if nothing had ever ended. Soren's camera clicked softly beside me, capturing the moment without drawing attention. He lowered it slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's recent," he said, showing me the screen. The image was clear, undeniable. Proof that the man I buried had never truly left. The first time I held Corin's death certificate in my hands, I had been too numb to read it properly. Grief reduces words to shapes. Signatures become blurs. Dates lose meaning, and you trust whoever tells you the paperwork is complete. Now, sitting across from Soren at his desk, I read every line slowly, as if the truth might be hiding between the margins. the name at the bottom stood out more than it ever had before. Leto. And the doctor who signed it. The same man who had stood beside Bram at barbecues years ago, laughing over old stories, shaking my hand like he belonged to our family circle. Soren didn't rush me. He let silence stretch until I finished reading. "Anything feel off?" he asked quietly. I nodded, though I couldn't yet explain why. The cause of death was listed as a sudden systemic failure. Broad clinical language that avoided specifics. No mention of extended testing. No detailed breakdown of symptoms. Just a conclusion delivered with unsettling certainty. We requested copies of the full medical file through legal channels, keeping everything procedural. It took days before the records arrived, sealed in a thick envelope that felt heavier than paper should. When I opened it, memories flooded back. Corin lying in that hospital bed, pale but calm, telling me he felt tired more than anything else. There had been no dramatic decline, no urgent alarms that suggested something irreversible, just a slow fading that everyone told me was natural. Soren flipped through the pages methodically, his investigator's instincts sharper than mine. He paused at the toxicology section, or rather, the absence of one. "There should be more here," he said, tapping the blank area where detailed screening results normally lived. My chest tightened. I remembered asking about further testing back then, and Leto reassuring me it wasn't necessary. He had spoken with authority, with the kind of calm that makes you feel foolish for doubting a professional. Old conversations returned to me in fragments, Bram and Leto sharing private jokes at gatherings, to disappearing into long discussions I never thought to question. I had trusted both of them, one as my husband, the other as a doctor who seemed to care deeply about our family. Now that trust felt like a thread unraveling in my hands. We cross-referenced timelines from Corin's hospital visits with Bram's movements before his supposed death. Small overlaps appeared. Visits that coincided too neatly with medical updates, phone calls that lasted longer than necessary. None of it proved wrongdoing on its own, but together they formed a pattern that made my stomach turn. The deeper we looked, the more clinical details began to feel incomplete. Prescriptions noted without clear justification. Dosage adjustments that seemed unusually aggressive. I forced myself to stay calm, to treat every discovery as information rather than accusation. The emotion could wait. Evidence came first. One evening, Soren called me back to his office with a tone that told me something had shifted. He'd been reviewing pharmacy databases tied to Corin's treatment history, searching for anything overlooked. When I arrived, he turned his laptop toward me without speaking. On the screen was a prescription record, a medication issued under Leto's authorization, filled only weeks before Corin's final hospitalization. The name meant nothing to me at first, just a long string of medical terminology. But Soren explained quietly that in certain dosages, it could mimic natural illness while gradually weakening the body. My hands went cold as realization crept in. The document didn't declare guilt. It didn't accuse anyone directly, but it suggested something far more dangerous than coincidence. Soren leaned back in his chair, his voice steady despite the tension in his eyes. "If this connects to what we think," he said, "then Corin didn't just die. Someone made sure he wouldn't survive. Patterns don't shout at you. They sit quietly in the background until you finally decide to look long enough." Soren spread the printed travel records across his desk, each sheet marked with dates that matched the circles on my kitchen calendar. Flights, rideshare receipts, short-term rental payments. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just repetition. 20 days gone, 10 days back, over and over again, month after month, as steady as a metronome. I traced one line with my finger, my voice barely above a whisper. "She told me it was contract work," I said. Soren didn't argue or agree, and he simply pointed to the next column. Hotel bookings in the same small town where we had seen Bram alive. My chest tightened as the reality settled deeper. This wasn't occasional travel. It was a life structured around disappearance. We built a timeline on a whiteboard, layering Ria's trips over Bram's utility payments, local activity logs, and surveillance timestamps. The lines began to overlap too perfectly to ignore. Every month she arrived within a day of new financial activity at that rental property. Every month she left just before the bills cycled again. The pattern felt intentional, precise enough to remove doubt from the equation. As I stared at the board, memories began pushing forward. Small moments I had once called grief, but now felt like rehearsed distance. I remembered holding Ria while she cried about missing Corin, promising her she could take all the time she needed to rebuild. I remembered comforting her after long trips, cooking meals she barely touched while she insisted she was just exhausted from work. I had believed every explanation because believing felt kinder than questioning. Soren pulled up surveillance footage collected from public street cameras near the rental house. Grainy images flickered across the screen, cars passing, pedestrians moving through ordinary afternoons. For a moment, it all felt distant, detached, like watching someone else's story unfold. Then he paused the video and rewound slowly. A familiar figure stepped into frame. Ria. She moved toward the house with the ease of someone who knew exactly where she was going. No hesitation, no confusion. She unlocked the door and slipped inside as if it belonged to her. My throat tightened, not from shock anymore, but from the weight of recognition. All those times I had reassured myself she was working, building a future, healing from loss. They rearranged themselves into something harder to accept. I sat with her through nights. She said she couldn't sleep. I murmured, more to myself than to Soren. I told her she was strong for keeping Corin's memory alive. The words tasted bitter now, not because I regretted loving her, but because that love had been used as cover. The footage continued, time-stamped proof of a routine I had never been meant to see. She entered the house at nearly the same hour each month, always carrying a small bag, always looking around briefly before closing the door behind her. There was no sign of fear on her face, only familiarity. Betrayal stopped feeling abstract. It became personal, threaded through every memory I had once called kindness. The woman I defended to relatives, the one I trusted with my grandson's future, had been living a parallel life right under my protection. Soren paused the video again and zoomed in on the frame where she crossed the porch. The image sharpened just enough to remove any lingering doubt. He didn't need to explain what we were seeing. The truth stood plainly on the screen. Ria wasn't visiting that house occasionally. She was going home to him. I used to think the past stayed where you left it. Old photographs, wedding memories, the quiet belief that whatever began in joy couldn't hide something rotten underneath. Sitting across from Soren with years of records spread between us, I realized how wrong that had been. Truth doesn't stay buried. It waits for the right moment to rearrange everything you thought you knew. He started with financial timelines, bank transfers dating back to the months before Corin's wedding, small enough to avoid attention but frequent enough to leave a pattern. They weren't made from Ria's personal account alone. Some traced back to business channels Bram once used. At first glance, they looked like routine support, wedding planning expenses, deposits, vendor payments. But when Soren layered the transactions side by side, a different picture emerged. Certain transfers moved quietly between accounts that had no reason to be connected. My chest tightened as I recognized dates tied to moments I remembered vividly. The week we finalized the venue, the day Corin picked up his suit, the evening we all sat together laughing over invitations. Those memories had always felt simple, filled with excitement and hope. Now they looked like markers on a map I hadn't known existed. Soren pulled up archived messages obtained through legal disclosure tied to Bram's financial activity. Nothing explicit, no dramatic confessions, just fragments of conversation that hinted at coordination long before the wedding day arrived. Short lines about timing, about waiting until everything is in place. At the time, they might have meant anything. Now, placed beside the travel patterns and hidden property, they suggested a bond that reached further back than I had ever imagined. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to hold on to the version of Rhea I once believed in. The young woman standing beside my son at the altar, on her voice trembling as she promised to build a life with him. The idea that something else existed beneath that moment felt almost impossible to accept. Yet the evidence sat in front of me, patient and unmoving. We traced the timeline deeper, aligning financial activity with key milestones in Corin's early marriage. There were payments made shortly after the honeymoon, unusual withdrawals that coincided with Bram's unexplained absences from home back then. Memories I had dismissed as coincidence returned with sharper edges. Conversations that ended too quickly when I walked into a room. Glances exchanged between them that I once interpreted as family closeness. I never wanted to see betrayal where love existed, I whispered. Soren didn't respond right away. He let the silence settle before sliding another document toward me. A sequence of transfers made on the eve of the wedding itself. The amounts weren't large, but their direction told a story. Money moving quietly from Bram's old business channel into an account Rhea controlled privately, separate from anything tied to Corin. The realization landed slowly, like a weight pressing against my ribs. This wasn't a sudden affair born from grief. It wasn't a mistake made after loss. Whatever existed between them had roots planted before my son ever said his vows. We mapped the dates against Corin's medical history. The first signs of fatigue, the early doctor visits, the subtle changes I had noticed but never questioned. The alignment tightened my throat. Payments shifted in the weeks leading up to his first hospitalization. Telemessages became more frequent, and Bram's movements grew harder to explain through ordinary routines. Soren leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral even as the timeline filled the whiteboard behind him. He tapped one date with the tip of his pen, a week before Corin's symptoms escalated. "That's when everything accelerates," he said quietly. I stared at the board, the past rearranging itself into something colder and far more deliberate than I ever wanted to believe. If this timeline held true, then my son's illness didn't exist in isolation. It grew alongside secrets that had begun long before anyone claimed to be grieving. And for the first time, the thought crossed my mind with terrifying clarity. Corin didn't just fall sick at random. His decline started exactly when their plans seemed to move forward. Aylan fell asleep with his head against my shoulder that night, his breathing slow and even, completely unaware that the world around him had begun to shift. Children don't carry suspicion. They carry trust. As I laid him gently in his bed, smoothing the blanket over him the way I had done 1,000 times before, I felt a strange pull between love and fear. Not fear for myself, but for the life he believed was solid and safe. The investigation had been moving steadily, each discovery tightening the threads around Bram and Rhea. But nothing prepared me for the direction Soren's research took next. It started quietly, buried in medical files we had requested to better understand Corin's treatment history. Routine paperwork, pediatric visits, vaccination records, the ordinary trail of a child growing up. No, I didn't expect anything unusual there. Ilan had always been healthy, and I had never questioned the details. Soren didn't present it as a revelation. He approached the subject carefully, like someone stepping onto fragile ground. "There's something in the records you should look at," he said, sliding a document across the desk toward me. It wasn't a DNA report, nothing that direct, just notes from a pediatric consultation mentioning blood type compatibility. At first, the numbers meant little to me. I read them twice before the implication began to form. Corin's blood type, Rhea's blood type, Ilan's. The combination wasn't impossible, but it raised questions that had never crossed my mind before. I felt my throat tighten as memories of Ilan's birth returned. The way I held him for the first time, convinced I was seeing a piece of my son continue in the world. I had protected that belief fiercely, not just for myself, but for him. Identity matters. Children build their sense of belonging from the stories adults give them, and I had told him stories filled with love, not doubt. Soren spoke gently, choosing each word with care. "This doesn't prove anything yet," he said, "but it opens a possibility." He explained how certain genetic combinations make parentage statistically unlikely, how medical notes sometimes hint at questions doctors don't voice directly. My hands trembled slightly as I set the paper down. I didn't want to see betrayal reaching into the one place I had always considered pure. Images of Ilan growing up in my home flooded my mind, his first steps across my living room floor, the nights he cried for a father he barely remembered, the way he clung to me when thunderstorms rolled through the city. Every sacrifice I made felt tied to protecting him from the chaos left behind after Corin's death. The idea that his identity might be built on a lie felt heavier than any discovery we had made so far. "What happens if this is true?" I asked quietly. Soren didn't answer immediately. He knew the question wasn't legal or procedural. It was personal. If Ilan wasn't Corin's son, then the story I had lived for 3 years, the one that gave meaning to my grief, would fracture in ways I couldn't yet understand. He turned the laptop toward me, showing a probability chart generated from the medical data we had collected. Numbers filled the screen, clinical and cold, then stripping emotion away from something that felt deeply human. According to the analysis, the likelihood that Corin was Ilan's biological father dropped lower than I expected. Not impossible, but fragile enough to demand deeper testing. My chest tightened as realization crept in, slowly. If Corin wasn't Ilan's father, then someone else was. And every piece of evidence we had uncovered so far pointed toward the same man, Bram. The folder Soren handed me felt heavier than any of the others, even though it contained nothing more than copies of medical notes and lab summaries. He introduced me to a forensic consultant, a quiet woman who spoke in careful, measured sentences, never rushing her conclusions. She didn't begin with accusations. She began with symptoms. Fatigue that worsened without clear cause. Mild organ strain that appeared inconsistent with Corin's age and health history. Small clinical details that once sounded harmless but now carried a different weight. We sat around a narrow conference table while she flipped through the timeline of Corin's final weeks. I listened without interrupting, forcing myself to stay grounded in facts instead of memories. She explained how certain compounds, when administered in controlled doses, can mimic natural illness. Slow enough to avoid suspicion, subtle enough to pass as stress or infection. It wasn't a declaration of murder. It was a possibility framed through medical logic. As she spoke, Soren projected hospital records onto the wall behind her. Dates shifted across the screen. Appointments, dosage changes, notes written by Leto that felt unusually brief compared to standard medical reporting. I remembered how calm he had been during that time, reassuring me that Corin's condition was stable, that we simply needed patience. Now those reassurances felt rehearsed rather than compassionate. One page caught my attention more than the others. A section of the record had been amended weeks after Corin's passing. Small edits marked as clarifications. The consultant paused there, her voice tightening slightly. "Posthumous adjustments aren't unheard of," she said, "but they usually expand information, not reduce it." The revised note removed references to earlier symptoms that might have justified deeper testing. The change was subtle, but it shifted the narrative of Corin's decline from uncertain to inevitable. And I felt my hands clench against the edge of the table. "Why would anyone change that?" I asked. The consultant didn't speculate. She simply pointed to the signature at the bottom. Leto's name, steady and deliberate. The pattern was becoming harder to ignore. Decisions that once looked like professional judgment now appeared unusually aligned with Bram's movements during the same period. Soren moved to the next slide, prescription logs pulled from pharmacy databases. The medication we discovered earlier appeared again, its dosage adjusted twice within a short window. According to the consultant, such changes should have triggered closer monitoring. Instead, the notes showed minimal follow-up. Leto had documented Corin's symptoms as expected reactions rather than warning signs. My mind drifted back to the hospital visits I thought were routine. Sitting beside Corin's bed while machines hummed quietly, trusting the doctor who spoke to me with calm authority. I remembered how Bram would step outside during long consultations, claiming he needed air, leaving me alone to absorb information that now felt incomplete. The consultant leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but careful. "I can't declare intent from paperwork alone," she said, "but the pattern here is consistent with controlled exposure to a substance that weakens the body gradually." She pointed to a chart showing the progression of symptoms. Steady decline without sudden spikes, the kind of pattern that blends into natural illness unless someone looks closely enough. Silence settled over the room as the implications took shape. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a theory supported by clinical logic and documented irregularities. Soren closed the file slowly, his expression tight with focus. "If this holds," he said quietly, "then Corin didn't just get sick. Someone managed his decline." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything we had uncovered so far. The first moment where possibility began to feel dangerously close to certainty. Truth stopped feeling like fragments after that. It started forming a structure, something deliberate, layered, almost patient in the way it hid itself. Soren called me into his office early that morning, his tone quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that meant the investigation had crossed into territory we couldn't manage alone for much longer. He laid out new documents across the table, property records, utility bills, bank activity that moved like a shadow between names and locations. The small rental house we had watched from across the cafe wasn't just a temporary hideaway. It was part of a system. Payments routed through secondary accounts, lease agreements written under an alias that linked back to Bram's old financial network. Nothing flashy, nothing extravagant. Just enough stability for someone who wanted to disappear without drawing attention. "He didn't vanish," Soren said, tapping the paperwork. "He downsized." The idea landed heavier than anger. Bram had chosen a smaller life on purpose. Modest expenses, minimal public exposure, routines that made him look invisible instead of powerful. It wasn't survival, it was strategy. We traced the money further back, following lines that led us to the insurance payout issued after his supposed death. I remembered signing forms with trembling hands, believing I was closing a chapter that grief had already sealed. Now those same funds appeared again, quietly redistributed through accounts that never fully disconnected from Bram's influence. Some transfers circled through Ria's private finances, disguised as routine expenses. Others vanished into payments tied to the rural property, utilities, maintenance, small renovations that kept the house functional without attracting notice. Every discovery reshaped memories I thought were settled. The days after Bram's funeral, when Ria insisted on handling certain paperwork because she said I needed rest, the reassurance from Leto that everything was legally sound, or the calm efficiency that once felt supportive now looked calculated. Soren projected a timeline onto the wall: Bram's declared death, Corin's illness, the shift of funds into secondary channels. Dates overlapped in ways that made coincidence feel impossible. "This wasn't built overnight," he said. "It's a long-term arrangement." The phrase settled heavily in the room. Long-term meant planning. It meant patience. It meant my grief had been a shield they used while building something I was never meant to see. We reviewed surveillance notes showing how carefully Bram avoided attention. grocery runs at quiet hours, cash payments where possible, no social media presence. Even his clothing choices blended into the background, simple jackets and neutral colors that made him forgettable to anyone who passed him on the street. Then he wasn't hiding like a fugitive. He was living like someone who knew invisibility was safer than distance. The deeper we went, the more complex the network became. Joint expenses appeared between Bram and Rhea, travel costs, recurring transfers that aligned perfectly with her monthly absences. What once looked like independent lives now revealed a shared rhythm built around secrecy. I felt my chest tighten, not from shock anymore, but from the slow realization that betrayal had been organized, not accidental. By late afternoon, Soren closed the last folder and leaned back in his chair. "We're past the point of private discovery," he said quietly. "There's enough here to warrant official review." I understood what he meant without him saying it outright. This wasn't just about family deception anymore. It touched legal territory. Fraud. Falsified death records. Financial manipulation. He reached for his phone and stepped out of the room briefly, his voice low as he spoke to someone I couldn't hear. When he returned, his expression had shifted from investigator to something more cautious. "They'll look at it discreetly," he said. "No public action yet, just verification." The word they hung between us, unseen authorities moving into a story that had once belonged only to me. And for the first time since this began, I felt the investigation step beyond our control, carried quietly into hands trained to turn suspicion into consequence. I never imagined revenge would look like paperwork. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, just a quiet room where folders moved from my hands into those of people trained to see patterns without emotion. And the investigators didn't treat me like a victim. They treated me like a witness. Calm, factual, necessary. I told them everything without embellishment. The phone lighting up, the rental house, the travel patterns, the medical records that didn't make sense. Each detail felt heavier when spoken aloud, but I kept my voice steady. Truth didn't need performance. They reviewed the files slowly, verifying timelines against public databases and cross-checking financial pathways Soren had already mapped. I watched their expressions shift in small ways, raised brows, exchanged glances, quiet nods that told me this was no longer just a family mystery. One investigator asked careful questions about Bram's funeral arrangements, about Leto's role during Corin's illness, about Rhea's access to accounts after my husband's supposed death. Nothing accusatory, just methodical. Before I left, they explained the next step: surveillance. Legal authorization meant they could observe without alerting anyone involved, documenting movements, verifying identities, confirming that the life we uncovered in that small town existed beyond suspicion. Hearing that brought a strange calm over me. I had spent weeks holding everything inside, pretending normalcy, while my world rearranged itself. Now the responsibility shifted slightly away from me and into a process built on evidence instead of instinct. Despite everything, I continued my routine with Rhea exactly as before. I visited when she asked, brought Ilan for short afternoons, listened to her talk about work as if nothing had changed. Emotional restraint became my shield. She hugged me longer than usual one evening, thanking me for never judging her. The words pressed against my chest, heavy with irony, but I smiled and nodded like the woman she believed I still was. Each normal interaction gave investigators time to observe without raising suspicion. Soren updated me carefully, never revealing more than necessary. Cameras placed in public areas near the rental property began capturing consistent activity. Bram leaving early in the mornings, Rhea arriving at familiar intervals, small routines that proved the pattern wasn't temporary. Financial monitoring confirmed continued movement through accounts tied to the insurance payout. Even Leto's clinic showed irregular scheduling that investigators quietly documented. The hardest part wasn't waiting for justice. It was maintaining silence while memories replayed differently in my mind. And I remembered defending Rhea to relatives who questioned her absences, telling them she deserved space to heal. I remembered standing beside Bram's grave, promising to keep our family together. Those promises didn't feel broken, just redirected towards something stronger than blind loyalty. Weeks passed without visible change, but beneath the surface, the net tightened. Investigators requested additional documents from pharmacies and property registries, building a legal foundation that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Every piece of evidence moved through official channels, ensuring that when action finally came, it would hold. One afternoon, I sat across from an investigator who had become my main contact. He closed a folder slowly and looked at me with quiet assurance. "We're close," he said. Everything points in the same direction." His tone carried neither excitement nor anger, only certainty. When I left the building, Soren met me outside, his expression unreadable. He handed me a single sheet of paper, not a full report, just a confirmation note indicating judicial approval for the next phase. I read it once, then again, letting the meaning settle into my bones. Arrest warrants were being prepared. The morning they moved felt ordinary in a way that almost made it unreal. Ilan was eating cereal at the kitchen table, humming softly to himself, completely unaware that years of quiet deception were about to collapse. I tied his shoelaces, kissed his forehead, and sent him off to preschool like any other day. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no signs that my life was about to divide into a before and an after. I didn't go to the rural town. That had been decided early. My role was to stay distant, to avoid interfering with a process that had finally moved beyond family into law. Instead, I sat in Soren's office, watching a live update feed from investigators. Not a dramatic broadcast, just occasional messages confirming locations and timing. The silence between updates felt heavier than any confrontation could have been. The first message came mid-morning. Bram had been approached outside the rental house. No resistance reported. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, trying to reconcile the image of the man I once trusted with the description of someone calmly placing his hands where officers could see them. There was no chaos, no shouting neighbors, just a quiet detention that fit the life he had built in shadow. And a second update followed soon after. Rhea had been contacted separately at her apartment, investigators choosing to keep the situations apart to avoid conflict or coordination. I imagined her standing in that doorway, the same place she once hugged me and thanked me for helping raise Elon. The thought didn't bring satisfaction, only a strange stillness. Leto's involvement unfolded more slowly. Authorities arrived at his clinic during regular hours, questioning him without shutting the practice down publicly. That detail mattered to me, not because I wanted him protected, but because it showed the investigation was moving with precision rather than spectacle. Every step felt measured, built to hold under scrutiny instead of collapsing into drama. Soren remained quiet beside me, reading each message before passing the phone back. Then occasionally he explained small details, how simultaneous actions prevented suspects from warning each other, how interviews would be conducted carefully to avoid contaminating evidence. Listening to him grounded me in reality. This wasn't revenge driven by anger. It was consequence shaped by patience. By afternoon, an investigator called directly. His voice carried the calm professionalism I had come to recognize over the past weeks. Bram had been transported for questioning. Rhea was cooperating but visibly shaken. Leto had provided initial statements through legal counsel. None of it felt like closure yet, only movement toward something inevitable. I walked outside to breathe, letting the cool air settle the storm inside my chest. Part of me expected relief, but what I felt instead was clarity. The secrets I uncovered were no longer mine to carry alone. They belonged to a system built to weigh evidence without emotion. Later that evening, Soren handed me a brief update summary. Nothing detailed, just enough to understand the direction things were taking. The language shifted subtly from fraud and deception towards something heavier. Investigators were reviewing Corin's medical records alongside new testimony, considering whether his death classification required re-evaluation. I read the line twice before it fully settled into my mind. There was a possibility, still unconfirmed but real, that my son's passing might no longer be considered natural. The courtroom didn't feel dramatic the way people imagine justice to be. No loud arguments, no sudden confessions, just quiet movement. Papers sliding across desks, and attorneys speaking in measured tones, and a steady stream of evidence turning suspicion into something heavier. I sat near the back, far enough to observe without becoming the center of attention. For the first time since this began, the truth existed outside private conversations and investigator briefings. It was being spoken into the record. The prosecutor outlined the timeline with calm precision. Bram's staged death, financial transfers routed through hidden accounts, Ria's repeated travel to the rural property, and Leto's medical decisions that aligned too neatly with Corin's decline. Hearing it laid out in sequence felt surreal. What once existed as scattered discoveries now formed a single narrative, one built on planning rather than coincidence. Public perception shifted quickly once details entered open court. Where reporters who once described Corin's passing as a tragic illness now used words like conspiracy and fraud. I watched strangers whisper to one another, their expressions changing as the story unfolded. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a heavy correction. The world learning a truth I had carried alone for months. Financial motives came into sharper focus as forensic accountants testified. Insurance payouts following Bram's supposed death had been redirected into accounts tied to the rental property and travel expenses. Small transfers between Ria and Bram revealed a pattern of shared resources that contradicted the image of a grieving widow rebuilding her life independently. The numbers were cold, clinical, but they explained why deception had lasted so long. Money gave their secret structure. Where I kept my eyes on the floor during most of the proceedings, listening more than watching. Seeing them, Bram seated beside his attorney, Ria avoiding my gaze across the room, would have added emotion to something that needed clarity. Instead, I focused on the rhythm of testimony, the steady way facts replaced speculation. Then came the part I had both expected and dreaded. A medical expert explained new findings related to Ilan's pediatric records. The language remained cautious, framed in probabilities rather than accusations. Blood type analysis and preliminary genetic comparisons suggested that Corin's biological connection to Ilan was unlikely. The courtroom grew quieter as the implications settled in. I felt my chest tighten. Not from shock. I had already prepared myself for this possibility, but from the weight of hearing it spoken aloud. The expert continued, emphasizing that further testing would confirm details definitively. But the numbers already pointed strongly in one direction. If Corin wasn't Ilan's father, then the only remaining candidate aligned with the rest of the investigation. Bram. For a moment, the room blurred around me. Memories of Ilan's first laugh, his small hand wrapped around my finger, the nights I stayed awake comforting him after nightmares. They all returned with a new layer of complexity. Nothing about my love for him changed, but the story I had built around his identity shifted under my feet. The prosecutor summarized the motive carefully. Financial gain, control over assets, went in a relationship hidden long before Corin's illness began. Each word felt deliberate, designed to replace grief with accountability. As the session ended, the judge scheduled the next phase of proceedings, his voice calm and unwavering. I remained seated long after others began to leave, letting the weight of what had been confirmed settle slowly. Because now it wasn't just suspicion or probability anymore. It was official. Ilan was almost certainly Bram's biological son. Ilan ran toward me the moment I stepped through the door that afternoon, his laughter echoing through the hallway like nothing in the world had changed. Children don't measure time by court dates or testimonies. They measure it by who shows up, who listens, who kneels down to meet them at eye level. I bent down and lifted him into my arms, holding him longer than usual, letting the warmth of his small body steady the storm inside me. The courtroom revelations had shifted everything, legally, emotionally, even the way strangers looked at our family. But inside my home, routines stayed the same. Dinner still needed to be cooked, homework still needed guidance, bedtime stories still ended with the same quiet promises that he was safe. That consistency became my anchor, the one place where truth didn't have to feel sharp. Guardianship discussions began quietly, away from public attention. Lawyers explained options in calm, practical language. Temporary arrangements while proceedings continued, long-term structures designed to protect Ilan's stability regardless of the legal outcomes facing the adults involved. I listened carefully, or asking questions that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with his future. The documents didn't feel like power moves. They felt like shields. One attorney paused during our meeting and asked gently whether I wanted to change anything about how Ilan saw himself. The question lingered in the air longer than any legal term had. Identity is fragile, especially for a child. Bloodlines matter to adults. Love matters to children. I realized then that truth didn't always have to arrive all at once. Some truths needed time, patience, and care, so they didn't break the person they were meant to protect. That night, as Ilan colored at the kitchen table, I watched him closely. The way he tilted his head when concentrating, the way he hummed quietly under his breath, none of that belonged to deception. None of that belonged to Bram or Ria's choices. It belonged to the boy I had raised with open hands and steady love. The thought settled deeply in my chest. Protecting him didn't mean denying reality. It meant choosing when and how reality reached him. Memories surfaced softly. The first time he called me by name instead of a formal title. The nights he asked questions about Corin that I answered with stories instead of pain. I understood then that revenge didn't have to look like punishment directed at everyone involved. Sometimes it meant refusing to let betrayal rewrite the parts of life that were still innocent. Soren checked in frequently, updating me on legal progress without overwhelming me with details. Investigators prepared for the sentencing phase, to gathering final statements and clarifying charges that had grown heavier as evidence solidified. Each update felt like a step closer to closure, yet I found myself less focused on outcomes and more on the quiet responsibility waiting at home. One evening, after Ilan fell asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table reviewing guardianship drafts. My signature would determine the structure of his future, schooling decisions, medical authority, financial protections. For a moment, I wondered whether choosing to keep him close might look like defiance to outsiders who expected anger to guide my actions. But anger had never built anything lasting. Love had. I signed the papers slowly, aware that this decision wasn't about proving strength to anyone else. It was about ensuring that when the world around him shifted, Ilan would still wake up to the same steady presence he had always known. Later that night, Soren called with a brief update. The final sentencing hearing had been scheduled. The date landed heavier than any discovery we had made so far. Not because I wanted punishment, but because it marked the moment where the past would officially close its grip on us. The end was approaching, and this time it wouldn't just expose truth. It would decide what justice looked like. The courtroom felt smaller on the day of sentencing, as if the walls had closed in to hold every truth that had surfaced over the past months. I sat in the same quiet place near the back, hands folded in my lap, watching the people who once defined my world stand before consequences they could no longer avoid. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confessions, just the steady rhythm of legal language delivering finality. Bram stood first. He looked older than I remembered, the sharp certainty he once carried replaced by something heavier. The charges against him stretched beyond deception. Fraud tied to the staged death, conspiracy linked to Corin's decline, and financial manipulation that threaded through every part of the hidden life he built. The judge's words were precise, measured, leaving no room for ambiguity. Bram was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful concealment of death records. He was sentenced to a long term of imprisonment, his hidden assets seized under forfeiture orders, and every financial channel he once controlled placed under permanent restriction. That accountability came not as a spectacle, but as a final closing of doors he had spent years quietly opening in secret. Ria's sentencing followed separately, her voice trembling when she addressed the court. I didn't look away, but I didn't hold anger either. She spoke about regret, about choices she claimed began as love and turned into something she couldn't control. Whether those words came from truth or fear didn't matter anymore. The evidence had already spoken louder than any apology. Because she cooperated with investigators and provided testimony that clarified timelines, the court issued a reduced but firm sentence, several years of supervised custody, followed by strict probation, loss of access to the financial benefits tied to Bram's scheme, and permanent legal restrictions regarding guardianship decisions. And the judge's ruling made it clear: participation carried consequences, even when remorse arrived late. Leto stood last, his professional calm fractured by the weight of medical decisions now judged under a different light. His medical license was permanently revoked, and he was convicted of professional misconduct and criminal negligence for authorizing treatments and altering records that obscured Corin's true condition. The court imposed custodial time alongside a lifetime prohibition from practicing medicine in any licensed capacity. Hearing Corin's name spoken with respect during the proceedings felt like a quiet restoration. The narrative that once described his death as inevitable had been replaced by acknowledgement that something deeper had occurred. When the judge concluded, the room didn't erupt into emotion. People stood slowly. Papers gathered, conversations whispered in low tones. Justice, I realized, rarely feels triumphant. It feels steady, like a door closing softly after years left open. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in a long time. Soren walked beside me without speaking, understanding that some moments don't need commentary. The investigation that began with a single phone screen glow had reached its end, not through anger, but through patience. Corin's name had been cleared formally, his memory no longer tied to unanswered questions. Life returned to smaller rhythms after that. Ilan's laughter filled my home the way it always had, untouched by legal language or courtroom tension. Guardianship finalized quietly, giving him the stability he deserved. I never rushed to redefine his story. Instead, I focused on building new memories. School mornings, evening walks, small celebrations that reminded him he belonged somewhere safe. Neighbors sometimes asked how I felt about everything that had happened, expecting a story filled with triumph or revenge. I always answered the same way. Truth had simply found its way back into the light. There was no need to celebrate someone else's fall when what mattered most was the life still standing in front of me. One evening, as Ilan colored at the table, I looked around the room and realized how much had changed without altering the core of who I was. Betrayal had tested every part of me, but it hadn't taken away my ability to love or protect. That, more than any verdict, felt like victory. I closed the last folder from the case and placed it in a drawer. One, not to forget what happened, but to remind myself that the story had reached its natural end. Revenge had never been about destruction. It had been about exposure, dignity, and letting the law carry what my hands no longer needed to hold. And as the house settled into quiet that night, I understood something with calm certainty. When everything fell, I didn't collapse with it. I stood,